Chess. It's been part of American history since the very beginning. Founding father Benjamin Franklin is often credited with one of the earliest known chess books, writing a manuscript in 1786 titled The Morals of Chess, in which he wrote, "The game of chess is not merely an idle amusement. Several very valuable qualities of the mind, useful in the course of human life, are to be acquired or strengthened by it, so as to become habits, ready on all occasions. For life is a kind of chess, in which we often have points to gain and competitors or adversaries to contend with, and in which there is a vast variety of good and ill events." That's all well and good, but it's likely you've heard all of this before if you're interested at all in chess and have watched any of the incredible free documentaries available to you here on YouTube. One in particular that's always stood out to me is the history of the World Chess Championship, published by chess.com. I love these videos, but one annoying nitpick I've always had with them is you get fed a lot of interesting history, but not a lot of actual chess. You don't get to see a lot of the games. So sometimes if you want something done, you gotta do it yourself. So in an increasingly vast internet landscape where standing out is next to impossible, this will be my feeble attempt to give this video a USP, as it were. In this video, I'm going to take you through a brief history of famous chess games played by revered players from across the United States of America. We're going to be taking a look at specific games of note that were played by these famous Americans. And because I'm no grandmaster myself, we'll be using the help of chess.com's chess engine to analyse these historical games with a modern retrospect. We're going all the way to 1858 and back again, so strap in. First on our American Chess Legends tour, it's perhaps the first true chess celebrity, Paul Morphy. Born in New Orleans, Louisiana in the year 1837, Paul Morphy rose to fame through his pioneering and aggressive chess. Morphy made his lasting impact on the game of chess in the space of only around 10 years. By 1858, the year in Morphy's career that this video will focus on, Morphy was 21 years old, and already a famed chess player. His fame caught the eyes of two European aristocrats, Karl II, Duke of Brunswick, and Count Isoard de Vauverargus. The two men decided to challenge the young Morphy, and thought the best way to go about this was to both attend an opera that they knew Paul Morphy would be at. So Morphy was on his holidays, trying to enjoy his opera in his private box, when these two noblemen rock up and challenge him there and then to a game of chess in the opera box. Morphy reluctantly agrees and continues to play this game while the opera is playing. So that's the setup for our first game, often referred to as the opera game. Paul Morphy versus the Duke of Brunswick and Count Isoard in a tiny private opera box in Paris, with Morphy controlling the white pieces and the noblemen both controlling black together, each agreeing on moves secretly as they go. Let's get into it. The first moves of our American chess tour are e4, e5. Both players play a traditional king's pawn opening, the most common first two moves in all of chess, even through to today. Morphy develops his knight and attacks the centre pawn. The pair respond with d6, defending one central pawn with the other. This is known as the Philidor defence. The Philidor opening is quite a slow opening. It does block in your dark squared bishop for black, but it does allow for the light squared bishop to get some scope right away, while also defending the central pawn from the knight's attack. Morphy strikes in the centre. This combination is popular in the Philidor because white is ahead in development with the knight on f3, so breaking the centre open is preferable as white because you're more prepared to follow up with an attack. The noblemen decide to move the bishop out to attempt to counteract this by getting one of their minor pieces into the game, but as we'll see, this move is actually a slight inaccuracy. It puts black in a slightly risky position and loses control of the centre of the board. Morphy captures in the centre, taking the pawn, which is a great move because this pawn can't actually recapture. If black were to recapture on e5, white would be able to capture the queen now being left open, which puts the king in check and forces the recapture. After this, the knight is then left completely free to capture that central pawn again. So to prevent this, the two men trade the knight for bishop on f3. Morphy recaptures with his queen so as not to damage his kingside pawn structure. This will become more important if Morphy decides to castle this way later in the game. The noblemen recapture the now undefended pawn in the middle, as that follow-up sequence with the knight isn't now possible. Morphy develops his bishop with tempo, as it threatens to checkmate on f7. Now tempo is a word that we're probably going to be using a lot throughout the video. As a brief explanation, tempo refers to a piece making a critical attacking threat on the turn, therefore gaining time or tempo as a result. Usually this is done with a pawn that attacks a stronger piece and forces a response from your opponent. So that's what Morphy does here, develops his bishop and attacks the pawn on f7, which threatens checkmate with the bishop and queen lining up. So black needs to block the queen's attack and does so with the knight. Morphy slides his queen right over the third rank behind the bishop, creating what's often referred to as a battery in chess, as both the queen and bishop align to form a battering ram. Black must then respond in turn, adding extra defense to the f7 pawn with their own queen. Morphy simply wants to bring more pieces to the party here and doesn't take the pawn on b7, considered by the engine and probably by quite a few of you watching to be the best move here. It does end up trapping the rook, but chess.com names knight c3 as the second best move, and we'll see why shortly. This pawn move by black is multi-purpose, as it now allows the queen to c b7, preventing the capture and trapping, and also cuts off b5 and d5 for the knight. Morphy develops his final minor piece and plants the bishop, attacking and pinning the knight on f6. The pair respond by rushing forward their pawn, attacking the bishop, which leads into our first brilliant move of our video according to chess.com analysis. Knight takes b5, sacrificing a knight for 2 pawns and a crushing attack on black's king. Black takes the bait by recapturing the knight and allowing the bishop to gain a check on the king. The duke and count block the check with their knight, considered to be the best move here, although the knight now is pinned to the king after this move. Morphy plays a very aggressive but ultimately very clever long castle here, not just to get his king to relative safety, but allow the rook to build up pressure on the pinned knight. The noblemen respond by adding support to the knight with their own rook. Rook takes d7. Now the chess.com engine doesn't think this is a brilliant move, but it is dead wrong. This move might be the finest in the game, if it wasn't for the beautiful and now world famous checkmating combination that follows. Morphy sacrifices his rook for a knight. The only way that black can recapture here is with their own rook, unless with the queen, but they're obviously not going to do that. When the rook recaptures, white could trade rooks again for his bishop, but this isn't Morphy's plan. Not easy to spot, but the best move according to the engine. Instead of recapturing immediately, piling up more pressure onto the attack by bringing out the other rook. Notice black could be okay here and be up a rook if they were able to trade on d1, but they can't because the bishop is still pinning the rook. This queen move by the pair is a last-ditch effort to try and trade queens and prevent the coming checkmate. And now for the move that makes this game as famous as it is. The earlier blue checkmark move was a bit of a letdown, and it's quite a common position to find yourself in that one. Likely you at home watching may have found yourself sacrificing a knight for these 2 pawns here before. But I guarantee you this next brilliant move really earns its title. We start by finally capturing the rook with bishop, which is a check. Black can't recapture with the king though, and obviously doesn't want to recapture with his queen because it's defended by the rook. So they take with the knight instead, which seems smart, but actually opens up the dark squared bishop cutting across the king. And here we have perhaps one of the finest moves in chess history. Queen to b8 check. It checks the king with the queen on the back rank. But wait, isn't that square guarded by the knight? Now if you're a chess veteran unlike me, you'll know that all the best chess moves look like blunders. Because the bishop cuts all the king's moves off, the only legal move for black is to take the queen with knight, which seems like the obvious move anyway, until rook d8 checkmate. Morphy uses his queen to force the knight out of the way and allow the dark squared bishop and rook to work together, cuts off the king and delivers a clear checkmate while being down 10 points of material. As we can see from this game, Morphy is famed for his aggressive playstyle, often sacrificing high value material to gain victory. But it is to be said that neither of these noblemen were considered chess grandmasters at the time. Both were maybe a bit cocky and underestimated the young Paul Morphy. For our next game, we're going to explore how Morphy's chess strategy holds up against another chess professional by the name of Adolf Anderssen. Anderssen was already world renowned in the game of chess, considered by many to be the greatest player in the world at the time. He and Morphy played a match lasting of the best of 13 games, again in Paris and again in 1858. At the time of the match, Morphy had contracted influenza whilst travelling, of which doctors prescribed the leading antibiotic of the day: leeches. The night before the match was scheduled to begin, Morphy was so ill that he couldn't get out of bed, and the last person he expected to visit him arrived: Adolf Anderssen. Seeing his condition, Anderssen agreed to postpone the arranged match until Morphy had recovered. We're going to see a lot of good sportsmanship in chess the more we go, just so you know in advance. Even with the delay, Morphy was said to be too weak to even stand without aid when he finally faced Adolf Anderssen. Today, we're going to look at the 10th game in this bout of 13, with Paul Morphy as white again and Anderssen as black. Morphy starts again with the king's pawn, and Anderssen replies with his c-pawn this time. You might know this opening as the Sicilian defence. Morphy plays the response known as the Smith-Morra gambit, which includes pushing the queen's pawn, which attacks the pawn on c5. Anderssen accepts the gambit and captures on d4. Morphy doesn't capture the pawn with his queen right away, even though she's looking right at it. Instead, playing the gambit that now bears his name, moving his knight into the centre and adding another attacker to the pawn on d4. Anderssen attempts to add extra protection to his pawn after this knight move, but Morphy recaptures the central pawn anyway. Anderssen plays a basic developing move, opening out his bishop and queen. Morphy, in typical all-out attack classical chess style, jumps his knight all the way over to b5, and Anderssen responds with another slow pawn move, trying to give his light squared bishop some scope. But like we saw with one of the black bishops in the previous game, now both bishops are trapped in. These two moves aren't blunders or mistakes by any means, but they are indicative of a slower game being played here, which is slightly unusual in classical chess. Usually we see all-out aggression from the opening, like what Morphy is doing right now. Morphy develops his dark squared bishop out to f4, and again Anderssen moves a pawn, this time with an attack on the bishop. Another good example of tempo, this one forcing a move from the bishop as you don't want to give up your bishop for a pawn. Anderssen hits out our first major blunder of the game with f5. Anderssen thinks he's getting ready to cut off white's bishop and get a nice pawn chain down the board. However, a fourth pawn move is far too slow, and we're going to see why another pawn move here is the fatal mistake by Adolf Anderssen. Morphy develops another knight. Chess.com says this simple move is a great move, simply because Morphy has 3 pieces in the game compared to black's 1. Anderssen again moves a pawn, thinking he's pressuring the bishop. A double check mark bishop sack, knight to d5. Morphy ignores the under attack bishop, instead moving his knight up to d5, baiting Anderssen into taking the bishop with the pawn, which Anderssen does. The trap is unleashed, and Morphy jumps his knight into black's back line onto c7. A check, which forks the king and the rook. Anderssen is forced to move his king onto an unsafe square. Morphy, according to the engine, actually makes a slight inaccuracy here. He comes out and checks the king with his queen, exploiting the unsafe position. This move allows Anderssen to block with the knight, which actually gets more of his pieces into the battle. Modern day computer analysis prefers following through with the fork and taking the rook here before proceeding with the attack. Morphy, however, isn't fussed with all this modern day chess analysis. He ignores this rook capture again and instead plays out his bishop, moving it in defense of the king and setting up a discovered attack. Anderssen counters by pushing his knight forward and attacking white's queen. Morphy initiates another devastating attack by capturing the knight defending the black king, also unleashing that discovered check with the bishop. Anderssen responds with the best move and the only move that ensures he doesn't lose the exchange, d5, blocking the bishop while also attacking it. Morphy captures the blocking pawn, again placing the king in check, and Anderssen makes a severe blunder here according to the computer, but it's quite hard to spot. The engine here says the game is surprisingly totally balanced at this moment. The only king move black could have made here was king e7, which looks a lot more dangerous, but it actually shields you from the queen's attack and allows some counterplay. The g6 move, however, here dooms the king. Morphy attacks with a devastating check, defended by the knight. Anderson captures this knight, but his king is so exposed that the game is pretty much over at this point. Morphy plays a slightly slower move at first glance, taking the centre pawn and placing some pressure on the knight. Morphy realises, however, that the rook getting into the attack and coming to f1 to check the king will be the nail in the coffin for black. Anderson does fight back with the fork on c2, however. Morphy just simply moves his king, because Anderson can't actually take the rook after pulling off the fork. If he takes, he's in checkmate, with the rook moving over to f1. In this position, Adolf Anderson had no choice but to resign the game to Paul Morphy, cementing his legacy as one of the greats of American chess. Morphy went on to defeat Adolf Anderson 7-3 in the best of 13 bout that they played together in 1858. After the game, Anderson posed that Morphy was the strongest player to ever play the game of chess, so he quit about a year later and became a lawyer. And to be honest, chess in America dries up for a long time. With the growing influence and popularity of international chess tournaments, American chess players were expected to face the very, very best from around the globe. And no other nation in the 20th century produced stronger chess masters than the Soviets did. It's no secret that ever since the Second World War, tensions between the United States of America and the Soviet Union, then Russia, have been tenuous at best. Perhaps most prevalently during the 1950s and 60s, the era of the Red Scare and duck and cover.
That's the first thing to do. Duck and cover. First, you duck. And then you cover. You duck and cover. Tight. Duck and cover under the
In this
table.
environment, a young man born in Chicago, Illinois, from an early age, studied the game of chess with his sister. Later in his life, he would go on to be one of the most symbolic individuals of not just American chess, but also the battle of Western ideals versus the Soviets of the time. Chess legend Bobby Fischer. But for now, Fischer is only 13 years of age, and already he's making headlines for chess prowess. Which takes us to our first game played by the legendary Bobby Fischer, who played international chess master Donald Byrne in a tournament game on October 17th, 1956. Bobby Fischer played with the black pieces and Byrne with the white. Now this opening is quite unconventional compared to what we've seen so far. It's known as the reti, moving the knights first and getting them attacking the centre. Byrne hits the centre with a flank pawn. This is known as the English. Fischer plays the pawn move g6, which prepares his dark squared bishop to perform what's known as a fianchetto. It places the bishop on g7, which allows a really nice square as the bishop gets the full central diagonal here from square to square of the board. This fianchetto is important because that diagonal can set up some devastating attacks later on, especially in the centre. If pawns start getting traded off, the king castles that way, that bishop there can be a really valuable attacker while also being a key defender. Byrne develops his second knight behind the c6 pawn. These moves here transition the game into another popular opening variation you've probably all heard of. It's known as the King's Indian. It's often credited and associated with Bobby Fischer as one of his key openings. It's important because the castle king lies safely behind a knight and bishop defender, both of which can quickly transition into key attackers within one or two moves. Byrne gets his bishops out to a nice central square and Bobby begins his centre attack with a d-pawn rush, defended by knight and queen. Byrne moves his queen out relatively early here, likely eyeing up a queenside castling opportunity, but Fischer captures his flank pawn, in turn putting pressure on the queen, one of the many issues with moving your queen this early in the game. Byrne recaptures with the queen, and Fischer responds with the best engine move, c6. It's a good move because it prevents opportunities for white's knight to gain more space. Another pawn thrust into the centre, likely to try and get rid of the knight on f6. Fischer ignores it though and develops his knight. Instead of castling, it looked like Byrne just needed to move his rook onto d4, a good square as it aligns now with the black queen on the d-file. Fischer moves his knight again, this time hitting the white queen. Byrne moves his queen forward, out of the knight's attack, but still in quite a precarious position, while Fischer finishes his minor piece development, now pinning the knight to the rook on d1. And at this stage of the game we reach our first major blunder, followed by our first brilliant move. Red question mark and blue exclamation mark living together in harmony. Fischer jumps his knight to the side of the board, which attacks the white queen again, whilst also attacking the knight on c3. But wait, isn't that knight also able to attack back? Again, we see another move that looks like a blunder but is actually brilliant. It's the whole idea behind Fischer's attack here, is to distract this white knight from the defense of the center. If white takes, then Fischer can recapture in the center with his other knight, which again attacks the queen on c5 and solidifies black's central attack. In a famous recounting of the game by Hans Kmock, the guy that penned the name The Game of the Century, he called it that in Chess Review magazine, where he also wrote, "During this move, a brilliant, most surprising stroke, a murmur went through the tournament room after this move, and the kibitzers thronged to Fischer's table as a fish to a hole in the ice." Byrne doesn't fall for it, however. He doesn't take the bait and he chooses not to take the knight, instead retreating his queen out of the attack and counter-attacking. Fischer isn't going to miss the opportunity to remove that central defender, so trades his knight for white's. Byrne recaptures the knight with a pawn, and Fischer finally gets to unleash that knight into the centre, capturing the central pawn with no piece there to defend it. Byrne does get some counterplay here, also capturing black's e-pawn with his bishop, which is supported by the queen all the way back on a3. It forks the black's queen and rook. Fischer isn't going to lose his queen obviously, so he moves it out of the attack of the bishop, which does sadly give up his rook in the process. Byrne doesn't take it right away, instead playing his first light squared bishop move, trying to build up pressure on the king. It's not good enough though. Fischer's going to let loose his second brilliant knight move of the game. He sacrifices it here to take the pawn on c3. Now it looks as if the queen can simply take back, and truthfully it's really hard to spot that this move actually wins material. If white did take the knight, then black would be able to move the corner rook behind the bishop, pinning it to the king and eventually winning it back. Byrne instead moves his bishop out of this potential future pin, again to attack the black queen. Fischer sneaks in the rook check on the king to get it out of the bishop-queen battery. Byrne chooses to hide his king away and loses his castling rights. He can't really block with any piece that's not going to get captured and create more problems, so probably a wise move. So now it's time for Fischer to obviously get his queen out of danger. He's thrown in his check, he needs to get his queen out of the way of this bishop, right?
Wrong.
Bishop to e6, leaving his queen completely exposed and moving the bishop on the other side of the board. Those watching who have dipped as much as a toe into chess YouTube will obviously be aware of the great Gotham Chess. And when he covered this game, he said,
"In this position, Bobby Fischer played bishop to e6. Now, if this is the game of the century in American terms, this is the move of the century. What a move.
The move of the century. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'm going to try and cover all the questions you might be asking yourself looking at this absolutely wild position. The most obvious move is just taking the black queen with the bishop. And indeed, that is what Byrne decided to do in this game, so we are going to see how that played out. I'll give you a hint though. Fischer's plan involves taking this bishop with check. Okay, so prevent that altogether. Take the bishop first. Then the queen's still exposed, and if black recaptures, you'll just take the queen. However, once the bishop is off this light square diagonal here, the queen can move down and put the king in check, which leads to an actual smothered mate eventually. So take the free knight with the queen. You defend your bishop, all's good. Well, this is actually just a trade, as the black queen can recapture the white bishop now because this defending pawn is pinned. So what happens when you take the queen then? That seems to be the best move. You're taking away your opponent's best piece. Yeah, you're going to get checked and lose a bishop, but you're taking a queen. Who cares? Fischer takes the free bishop as we discussed and puts the king in check. The king only has one legal square to move in here, as keep in mind the rook rules the e-file, which allows Fischer to jump in with his knight for another check. Byrne again moves his king back to the only square possible. These two squares here are the only two squares the king can possibly move to right now, which is really unfortunate for white because it's aligning again with Fischer's bishop, allowing the knight to move anywhere and put the king in check. Fischer repeats the checking combination a couple more times to allow his knight to maneuver around back to c3 and attack the rook. Notice now with the d-pawn gone, the phi and kettled bishop defends the knight from the queen. Fischer doesn't actually take the free rook with his knight and instead recapture the bishop that all those moves ago captured his queen. opening up the rook on the file, attacking Burns' queen. Burn attempts to put pressure onto Fischer's attacking pieces by moving his queen up and hitting the black bishop. Fischer responds with the unconventional attack/defense by pushing the rook all the way up to the bishop's aid, preventing the queen's capture while also attacking it. Notice that every single piece here is supporting another. Burn retreats, and trying to salvage what he can from the situation, takes a free pawn with his queen. At least he still has a whole queen over Fischer, but not a rook anymore, as Fischer does eventually capture that free rook right on the back rank with his knight. A pawn move from Burn to make room for his king and allow the rook to get out. Fischer captures a free pawn. Burn moves his king to h2 while Fischer captures another free pawn. I think it's fair to say that the bishop-knight checking combination took the spirit out of Donald Burn at this point, but fairly he makes the call to try and trade, so he can more easily use the queen that he has over Fischer. Burn comes in with the queen to check on the back rank, but Fischer is still prepared with a simple bishop block. Burn recaptures the rook and Fischer moves his bishop back one square, adding pressure on the king's side while simultaneously blocking in the white queen on the d-file. Both players make centralizing knight moves. Burn attempts to attack a pawn, but Fischer simply moves it forward so that it's defended. Burn's trying at every opportunity to create counterplay, but Fischer moving the king to g7, which gets out of the pin from the queen and sets up the bishop to start coming back into the attack. Burn attempts to numb the devastation that d6 move would cause by moving his king out from behind the knight. So instead, Fischer puts the bishop on c5, check, beginning the combination that will eventually lead to checkmate. Fischer, in an unbelievable display, walks Burn's king all the way across the back rank with his minor pieces, checking and blocking the escape with every single move, until he eventually delivers a stunning checkmate on c2.
My next guest is prepared to take on the Russians single-handed, and he may win. You know that Russia dominates the chess world, if you know even as little about chess as I do. And Bobby Fischer is an authentic genius who is stalking one Russian chess master after another. Will you welcome, gentlemen, a bright boy from Brooklyn, Mr. Bobby Fischer.
Chess had never been so huge in popular culture, at least in America, until Bobby Fischer hit the scene. Fischer became an international sensation.
I'm sure the entire world knows the name Bobby Fischer by now.
And rose ever more to prominence through his repeated televised determination to defeat then world chess champion Boris Spassky.
Sound factual?
Well, that stuff about Spassky being the great master, I didn't go for too much, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
The rest was okay.
Isn't that his official title? It wasn't a value judgment. I know.
No, he's a grandmaster. I'm a grandmaster too.
Yeah, well, you'll mop the floor with him, I'm sure.
Since the days of Paul Morphy, before a true chess world champion was established, it would be difficult to judge who exactly was the world's best chess player of the time. But by 1972, the official World Chess Championship had already been declaring champs for 86 years at that point. Starting in 1886, the champion of chess was crowned by this prestigious title, and in the tournament of 1972, it had seen 24 years of Soviet dominance, starting with Mikhail Botnavic in 1948, and now in 1972 with Boris Spassky, who had held the title for 3 years previous so far. Perhaps the most politically charged and important chess tournament of all time, the 1972 World Chess Championship saw Bobby Fischer meet Boris Spassky, a clash of Western individualism and creativity versus the Soviets' rigid and uniformed ways. In this time period, International Chess Corporation FIDE dictated a best of 25 games match, with the first player to get above 12 declared the winner. Today, we're going to analyse Game 6 of this tournament. By this point in the match, Fischer had infamously delayed the tournament on several occasions. Fischer had lost the first 2 games of the tournament, and this seemingly prompted him to demand that all cameras be removed from the tournament room while the game was in progress. No one is really sure to this day why Bobby Fischer behaved like this during the tournament. It may have been a fear of Spassky's analytical team cheating behind the scenes. Maybe the delaying and rescheduling was a psychological game to wear Spassky down before playing. Or perhaps Fischer simply really hated being on camera while he was playing chess. One way or another, by game 3, Fischer picked up the pace, scoring 2 games and a draw against Spassky, taking us to game 6, seen as the real turning point for Bobby Fischer. Fischer playing as white and Boris Spassky as black. Bobby Fischer as white plays an opening that's quite unconventional for him, and as the game transposes shortly into the Queen's Gambit, we'll see why this particular game is of note not only in the history of American chess, but in the history of Bobby Fischer's chess career. Fischer develops his knight to the centre as Spassky takes control with his d-pawn. This move in particular was out of character for Fischer, who prior to this match had been a harsh critic of the Queen's Gambit opening, encouraging players to avoid using this particular line. So out of his comfort zone, Fischer proceeds into a position he knows his opponent has more experience and confidence with. More standard developing moves, Spassky's trying to take a much slower approach, preparing to castle kingside early. Fischer gets the bishop into play while Spassky does indeed castle. Fischer backs up the pawn in the centre, preparing a solid pawn chain across the dark squares. But Spassky attacks the bishop with a pawn. Fischer retreats his bishop to the edge of the board and Spassky prepares to fee and kettle his. Here we have the first trade of the game. Fischer gets the centre open with his flank pawn. Spassky chooses to recapture with the knight, opening up the bishop-queen battery. Fischer gets rid of the battery with his own bishop, and Spassky recaptures with the queen. Following is a trade of knights in the centre, which Spassky must recapture with a pawn. The game is completely equal here according to the engines, 0-0, and both players have played perfect book moves so far. More developing book moves, black with their bishop, white with the rook. Fischer brings his queen to the side of the board, and Spassky responds by adding attack to the centre with a flank pawn. What seems like a pointless queen move actually pins this central pawn to the queen behind it. So if the pawn were to try and trade, white could come and snatch the queen behind for free. So Spassky moves his rook over to support. Fischer develops his final minor piece, and Spassky tries to gain tempo by attacking it, but he can't actually take this bishop next move because of the rook that's undefended behind it. Instead, Fischer trades off the pawns, leaving his bishop b. Fischer decides that now is the time to get his king to safety, and he castles, while Spassky brings his rook forward 1 square, subtly defending it with his queen so that his bishop capture is now possible. Fischer retreats his bishop back, and Spassky develops his final minor piece, the knight, to d7. The pinned pawn that was set up earlier allows Fischer to play very aggressive here, and push forward with the knight. Black can't take, so he retreats his queen to defend the rook and allow the pawn capture. So Fischer does what's known as a desperado and cashes out with his knight to capture the bishop, which Spassky does recapture with the f-pawn. Fischer starts trying to crack open the centre and the diagonal on that king by pushing pawns. Spassky makes the first move that chess.com deems to actually be an inaccuracy here, 20 moves into the game. The engine suggests just take the free pawn here instead of pushing past, because this allows Fischer to push his f-pawn supported by the rook, starting to line up pressure on the enemy king. If the pawn had captured, en passant would have been possible here. Another inaccuracy from Spassky. This rook move really doesn't accomplish any progress. The bishop comes in to attack the pawn on e6, lining up along the king's diagonal, so Spassky responds by tucking the king in the corner, away from this dangerous diagonal. Fischer slides his queen all the way from one side of the board to the other, all the way along the rank, lining up with the black king and setting up some checkmating opportunities in the future. A solidifying pawn move from Fischer, who doesn't want to allow the rook to invade on the second rank. Spassky tries to rush the pawn to counter this. Pawns trade as Fischer puts that pawn closer to the king. Fischer recaptures with the rook. He now has a queen, rook and bishop dancing around the black king in the corner. Spassky puts his knight in a defensive position to prepare for the coming attack. Fischer bringing the other rook to create another battery on the f-file. Both players edge their major pieces around, trying to create an advantage in this really tight closed position, defending key pawns. Spassky creates his own battery in defense of the g7 pawn in front of the king, but Fischer is pushing pawns, trying to get it in closer. Both queens move to the e-file to support their respective rooks. But Spassky seems at this point to really be succumbing to Fischer's chokehold, and he begins repeating moves, trying to maybe salvage a draw from the game. Play continues with Spassky repeating these queen moves, and Fischer is trying to successfully coordinate his minor pieces to deliver checkmate. This continues until this knight move, where Spassky tries to get his knight back into the game and attack Fischer's queen. Another brilliant move from Bobby Fischer, who doesn't care much for rooks it seems, and trades another one off for a knight here, which will allow him to set up a devastating attack down this f-file in a moment. The rook takes the pawn, which secures that scope on the f-file. Spassky tries to run his king out to perhaps support the defense or to try and escape, as no pawns are now there to defend the king in the corner. The bishop comes back to ensure that that pawn can't be captured. This final move sets up a killer blow of the rook and queen. In this position, Boris Spassky resigned the game, as there's no way to prevent that rook coming to the back rank and taking that queen. Primarily because this pawn on e6 provides little room for black rooks to come in and defend anything. After Spassky resigned, he stood and joined the crowd in applauding Bobby Fischer, who called his opponent a true sportsman, and the game from then on was nicknamed the Applause. After this game and the 15 thereafter, Fischer came out of the tournament with 12.5 points to Spassky's 8.5, cementing him firmly in place as the new chess champion of the world. This, however, is where I'm going to end Fischer's story, as you get a bit more modern and it gets a bit... As of recording in 2025, Bobby Fischer is currently the first and only American chess player to hold the official World Championship title. But in 2025, there are a few contenders that in the next few years may prove that they have what it takes. Two contemporary American chess players of particular note are Hikaru Nakamura and Fabiano Caruana. Both in the past few years have rose to chess fame not just through their over-the-board play, but also their extensive and instructive presence online. Indeed, like Gotham Chess, it's likely that if you clicked on this video, you've seen a Hikaru video before. By today, FIDE have altered the format of the championship, and often the actual championship battle is the least interesting and exciting part of the overall tournament, thanks now to the candidates tournament that takes place to determine who will face the grand champion. In the candidates trials, various chess grandmasters are selected through the year's tournament winnings to qualify for the final 8 that participate in the candidates. Often, it's the best event to see all the best chess heads from around the globe duke it out for the top spot. Both Hikaru Nakamura and Fabiano Caruana qualified for the final 8. All the players play various rounds of games against each other, scoring points depending on wins, draws, and losses, and these determine the final scoring. In round 8 of the tournament, America met America when Nakamura drew Caruana, and the two faced off in one of the more exciting games of the day. Nakamura played with the white pieces, and Caruana this time with the black. Both players start off with a king's pawn, and develop knights to the centre, a classical and common opening. The bishop moving to the b5 square is the world famous opening called the Ruy Lopez. Responding with the a pawn, which Caruana did here, and attacking the bishop is called the Morphy's defence, which brings us full circle, showing the influence of classical chess all the way through to the present day. Nakamura retreats his bishop whilst Caruana gets another piece into the centre. More developing moves, chess.com labels all these as standard book moves. Both players with a very sound position, chess.com evaluates as totally equal. Both playing defensive knight moves, gradually improving their position before orchestrating a full attack, which is a lot more common in modern chess compared to classical chess, which was a lot more about attacking early and throwing as many pieces as possible, as quick as possible. This kind of knight move in particular is commonly seen at modern high-level chess play, bringing the knight back to the first rank in defense of the castled king, as the knight guards the h2 pawn, preventing any annoying checkmating threats that black could pose. Caruana takes the opportunity to strike with a pawn in the centre. Nakamura trades and Caruana takes back with the knight. Chess.com engine deems this to be our first inaccuracy of the game, much preferring to recapture with the queen here to get another piece into the game. It's likely that Caruana did see this move though and decided against it for his own queen's safety. Nakamura slides his bishop back to a better diagonal, and Caruana reinforces the knight to try and shut this down. It's now Nakamura's turn to break the centre open, so he too pushes forward his d-pawn, which Caruana is such a hard name for a Scotsman to say. Please, make your name easier for a Scotsman to say. Which Caruana decides to capture. Nakamura also takes with his knight, but chess.com likes this one and thinks it's the best move. You're not likely to take with the queen here unless you want to lose the game immediately after all. Caruana decides to trade a bishop for a knight here. Typically seen as a poor trade, especially in high level chess, bishops are often valued higher than knights. However, chess.com recommends this move, so I'll shut up. Nakamura takes back with his pawn and Caruana centralizes his knight. Both players make a bishop move. Nakamura's now lines up better with the black king. Nakamura pulls his knight up to a more active space and Caruana gets super aggressive with the knight, bringing it up to f4. Nakamura doesn't stand for this and makes the bold move rook to e4. Very interesting move here, bringing the rook out very early on and attacking this aggressive little knight here. Caruana has no choice really but to retreat back to the square he came from. Slow move from Nakamura, trying to take options away from the knight while Caruana tries to get his rook set up. Caruana jumps his knight back and attacks the white rook, gaining some time. Nakamura doesn't move the rook, and instead moves the bishop and pins the knight to the queen, preventing the capture. Caruana tries to counteract this by putting some pressure on the bishop with a pawn. Left with no options, Nakamura takes the knight so as to not lose his rook, which Caruana recaptures with his queen. Caruana tries to offer a queen trade, but Nakamura declines it, blocking with the rook instead, which allows Caruana to continue with his original knight attack on f4 now that the rook is moved. Nakamura pressures the queen, forcing Caruana to move her away. He places his queen on d5, targeting the g2 pawn, which threatens mate in 1. Nakamura blocks the mate with the rook, a risky move, but it in turn does attack the knight, so no pawn for f5 for example, as you could just take the knight with the rook, which eliminates the checkmate threat. Caruana saves the knight instead, moving it back to defend the king once more. Caruana actually missed a really incredible tactic here according to chess.com. By taking the g2 pawn here anyway, it's essentially free, as if white were to take back, that move I mentioned, f5 is now possible, and the rook is pinned to the king, so you're going to lose a rook for a knight, which is actually quite a good trade in the end. So taking the g2 pawn here and sacrificing the knight is considered a great move by chess.com here, not seen in the game. Nakamura creates a battery on the e-file, and Caruana plays another one of these defensive knight moves, tucking the horse right next to the king. Nakamura attacks the queen to gain more space. He also gets his pawns further forward, pressing into black's territory. Caruana tries to challenge the rook battery by bringing his bishop back and defending his own rook on the back rank, but this is actually a big mistake as it allows the following combination. Nakamura uses his battery to capture the black rook, and of course Caruana retakes with the bishop he just set up, placing all of his pieces back on the starting rank. With the e-file now totally under white's control, the knight push up to f5 comes with the serious threat of the check on e5. With this queen move from Caruana, this move is still possible, but because the black queen can now defend the corner, will not lead to checkmate. Instead, Nakamura moves his queen to b4, also looking at the e7 square, with the main target being the knight behind it, which you'll see in a moment. This pawn move from Caruana here is another mistake and a little bit of an oversight, as the attack coming from Nakamura is too crushing and needed more defense. Nakamura delivers that crushing check on f7, forcing the king into the corner as the white bishop watches h7. Notice the king move leaves the black knight on f8 completely undefended. The final crushing blow, knight to d5. This is where Caruana resigned, as he has no real options left to salvage the game. Taking the knight with the pawn is probably the biggest mistake, as that allows immediate checkmate with queen takes f8. Notice how the bishop watches this square here, so the king can't escape. The only other option is to not allow checkmate and to defend this f8 square. Any other option immediately loses the queen because of the simultaneous attack by this knight here. A crushing blow and a great way to end our history of chess and bring us up to the modern day. Hikaru won this particular game, but unfortunately he didn't come out in first place of the 8 candidates. Whilst Caruana and Hikaru played exceptionally well in the tournament overall, they both came out with the exact same score of 8.5 points. Just a half point shy of our new world chess champion, Gukesh Domaraju, who finished with 9 points. And that is where American chess stands today, with a very, very close margin of half a point between the USA and championship glory once again. It could be very soon we add another American world chess champion to the history books. In our time, it can increasingly feel like we are the pieces on a chessboard, being moved around at the whim of those much more rich and powerful. reverence, and respect are often misdirected away from true talent and dedication towards liars and cheats. It can be important to remember that the stories that live on, that we hold as legends and pass on to others, always centre around the individual. Franklin was right then, in a way. With aggressive and bold playstyles adopted since the bubbling tensions of Morphy's time in 1858, 3 years before the American Civil War, carried all the way over to the Cold War paranoia of the 1950s and 60s, through to today's global situation. Chess tells the story of the United States in a unique way few other games can, from the spontaneity of early players through the computer age of analysis to today. The format of this video is definitely in its infancy, so if you liked, please like, and if you really liked, then why don't you subscribe? Also drop any feedback you may have down in the comments as well. I hope this was informative and good and instructive and fun. It was obviously quite a brief summary of American chess when put in perspective. Arguably I've missed out key individuals like Wilhelm Steinitz, and not mentioning IBM and Deep Blue at all, but could always be part 2. That will have to wait though, as a follow-up to this video is already in the works. Let's see if you can guess what it is.